If I were to drive to the Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado, I'd have to pay a fee of $25, unless I snuck into the park somehow, say, parachuting my vehicle into the park at night. It'll probably be cheaper to pay the $25. If I were to speed down the road in the park, I'd have to pay a fine. If I wasn't going too fast, the fine could be $25, unless I don't get caught. Now, what's the difference between a fee and a fine? In both cases, the government requires that I pay them $25, yet the fee to enter the park is a fee, and the ticket for speeding is a fine, a form of punishment. Here's another example. An individual commits a murder, is taken into custody, convicted of the crime, and sentenced to life in prison. Another individual commits a murder, is taken into custody, but this one is judged incompetent to stand trial due to mental illness. This individual is confined to a mental hospital. The first murderer is being punished. The second murderer is being committed, but is not being punished. Ultimately, the question we're interested in is what justifies punishment. But in order to answer that question, we first need to answer the question, what is punishment? We need to know what it is we are justifying before we know whether or not it can be justified. In his book, The Problem of Punishment, the author David Boonin presents the problem in just this way. Boonin's position is that punishment is never justified. He starts the argument by explaining what punishment is, and that's something we're going to need to know if we're going to engage in this discussion. First, according to Boonin, a punishment is a harm, or more precisely, it is to cause something bad to happen to somebody. Boonin states this criterion as follows, quote, "Perhaps the most obvious quality that these practices have in common is that they are all in some way bad for the person on whom they are inflicted." Unquote. A fine involves taking away somebody's money. Imprisonment takes away their liberty. A whipping or a caning is painful. There's also the option of public humiliation, putting somebody in stockades. We can take away privileges such as a driver's license or a right to vote. We can chop off a limb or a tongue or off with their head. These are all forms of punishment, and they are all cases of doing something bad to somebody. Is this true of all punishment? Boonin considers various potential counterexamples to his proposed definition. For example, in punishing a child, the ultimate goal, the measure of successful punishment in this case, is typically not to harm the child. The ultimate goal is to produce a benefit, to alter the child's disposition for the better, from which the child and others can harvest future benefits. But still, Boonin tells us the means towards this ends is a harm, something unpleasant or disliked that teaches them a lesson. The punishment itself is a harm, even if it eventually helps the person being punished. But still, surgery is a harm that also produces future benefits. It's not punishment. For something to count as punishment, it must be harmful or unpleasant or in some way bad for the person. But not everything done to a person that's bad counts as punishment. Let's continue with the surgery example. In the first case, somebody amputates a hand because it has become infected, and one must prevent the infection from spreading to the rest of the body. Compare this to a person who has a hand removed because this is the culture's punishment for theft. Both acts inflict the same harm, the removal of the hand. But surgery is not punishment. To distinguish these cases, Boonin adds a second criterion. The harm is inflicted intentionally. The surgeon isn't seeking to remove the hand. The surgeon is seeking to prevent the spread of the infection. If she could do so while saving the hand, that would be great, but she can't. The purpose of punishment is to have the individual harmed. This is a part of the goal. If removing the hand wasn't bad, the punisher would find something else that is bad. The way Boonin puts it, quote, "It is not merely that in sentencing a prisoner to hard labor, for example, we foresee that he will suffer. Rather, a prisoner who is sentenced to hard labor is sentenced to hard labor so that he will suffer. And if a given form of labor turned out to be too pleasant and enjoyable, he would be sentenced to some other form of labor for precisely that reason." End quote. The combination of these two features, intentionality and doing harm, is what makes punishment problematic. Punishment involves doing those types of things to people that we typically punish people for doing, and that's a problem. There are still a few more criteria for punishment that we need to look at. In addition to intentional harm doing, something doesn't count as punishment unless we inflict it on people as a response to something that they have done. If you just hit somebody for no reason, that's not punishment. If you throw the individual who hit somebody for no reason into prison, that counts as punishment. Specifically, Boonin says, quote, to be a punishment, an act must involve intentionally harming someone because he previously did a prohibited act. And since we're concerned in this book with legal punishment in particular, we can be more specific. To be a legal punishment, an act must involve intentionally harming someone because he previously did a legally prohibited act, which means that he is responsible for having done the act and that he had no valid legal excuse for doing so. End quote. If we take this claim that punishment is a response for doing a previously prohibited act, well, it would seem to follow that you can't punish an innocent person. It's just not possible, because an innocent person hasn't performed a prohibited act. For example, while you certainly can execute somebody for a murder they didn't commit, this isn't punishment. It's something else. Boonin defends this conclusion by comparing punishment to something like repayment. Assume somebody borrowed $10,000 from the bank, and then without his knowledge, his brother pays off the loan, and now this individual owes nothing. If the individual then gives the bank $1,000, he is not repaying a loan because there's no loan to repay. He's falsely believing that he's repaying a loan. If somebody is innocent of a crime, then one can falsely believe that he's being punished, but he can't actually be punished. Boonin then goes on to claim that it really doesn't matter whether we accept or reject this part of his thesis. We could have a strong retribution requirement, which is the requirement that Boonin argues for, where an individual is being punished for what an individual did. Or we could specify a weak retribution requirement, where an individual is being punished for what one thinks the individual did. It really doesn't matter. We can choose either option without our choice having serious philosophical consequences. At this point, I'm going to mess with the order that Boonin used to present his theory for reasons I'll explain later. So what Boonin mentioned as his fifth requirement, I'm going to list as his fourth. And this is that punishment comes from an official source. The question here is whether vigilante justice or private revenge counts as punishment. In a college dorm, for example, imagine a student's neighbor in the next room making noise far into the night when the student is trying to sleep. So the next morning, that student, while preparing for class, makes sure to make a lot of noise in order to wake the neighbor up. This is a harm intentionally inflicted as retribution for the neighbor's action. However, Boonin argues that this doesn't count as punishment because it doesn't come from an official source. We might have a dispute here. Some people seem to want to count this as punishment and some don't. But Boonin argues we can sidestep this question just like the previous question. We're discussing philosophy of law. We are concerned with harms intentionally inflicted on somebody as a reaction to breaking the law. So even though other types of punishment might exist, we're only interested in punishments inflicted for breaking the law. I moved Boonin's fourth criteria to the end to discuss it separately. This fifth criteria is that of condemnation. This element of condemnation, according to Boonin, is what distinguishes a fee, paying $25 to enter a park, and a fine, paying $25 after being caught speeding. The cost to the individual is the same in both cases, and the costs are intentionally imposed. In order to make the act retributive, let's make it the case that, like some parking lots, one collects a ticket on entering the park and pays upon leaving, depending on how long one stayed. Now, in both cases, an individual pays $25, a cost that is intentionally inflicted because of what the person has done, and that cost is authorized. Or think of how a carbon tax works, at least on some systems. For every ton of carbon emitted, one pays a $100 carbon tax. We have here a harm, a $100 payment, required by the government, intentionally inflicted because of something that the person has done. In this case, emitted 1 ton of carbon, but it's not punishment. The fee, paid when leaving the park, and the $100 paid for emitting 1 ton of carbon dioxide do not come with this message of condemnation for performing an act that one should not have performed at all. A fine or imprisonment does include this message. So the claim is that to count as punishment, the cost must come with this dose of condemnation. Punishment includes a claim that what the person did was wrong, was something a decent person would not have done. It is the perpetrator's fault. Taking the term fault literally, it is a failing. If the question we are asking is, what justifies punishment? And punishment contains this element of condemnation, then a part of the question is going to be, what justifies this condemnation? What would make it the case that condemnation is a justified response to certain types of actions, for example, to breaking the law? And this is related to another subject. The state's claim to a right to a monopoly on legitimate punishment. As a private citizen, you're not entitled to fine, imprison, or execute people. When it comes to criminal punishment, only the government and its authorized agents can impose punishment. So, what is it about harms intentionally inflicted as retribution for breaking a law and seasoned with an element of condemnation that makes it something that governments are permitted to do, but individuals are prohibited from doing? These are interesting questions, but they'll be addressed in other videos. The point here is simply to clarify the question of whether and how legal punishment can be justified by answering the question, what is punishment? What is this thing that we're trying to justify? David Boonin provides us with a useful model. Punishment is a harm, accompanied by condemnation, intentionally inflicted in response for breaking a law as authorized by the government. How can such a thing be justified, particularly when legal punishment is also prohibited to everybody else but the government?